Today is a received wisdom, right? None of us even bother to think about these things. Received wisdom, separate languages. When William Carey, Thomas Colebrook, and Charles Wilkins, they all believed that every Indian language is derived from Sanskrit. That was their thinking when they first came to India and so on. However, there was a person called A.C. Campbell who was based in the Telugu regions, and he wrote a book called Telugu Grammar in 1816. His primary aim was to disprove these guys, to show that no, there is one more language family in India and it's not all from Sanskrit. His mentor was somebody called Francis White Ellis, and he wrote a 40-page foreword to this Telugu grammar, and that has come to be called as a Dravidian proof. So in this 40-page proof, he went around saying, for example, he took a word list. One example that I give you is for milk. Milk is such a deeply embedded word in our culture, right? Because farming, animal husbandry, and so on. So he said, in southern India, if you go and look at the Tamil word, it's called Pala. If you go to Telugu, it's called Palu. If you go to Kannada, it is called Halu. If you go to Hindi, it's called Dud. If you go to Sanskrit, it's called Dugd, and so on. So different languages, different things. So he said that from Dud to Palu is such a big difference. That means they're probably not related. So he came about with a bunch of words like this, including the structure of the, he compared a word list from Dattapatha. I think it is a work from Panini's word list, and Telugu list by a Shastri. The Shastri professor was working in a Sanskrit college, and he compiled this list for him, and he worked off on that one, compared the roots of those words, compared word list of Kannada, Tamil, Telugu, showed the cognates. Cognates are when the words are all related to each other in some way, like Halu, Palu, Pal, and all these kind of things. Compared the word list constructed from roots of Kannada, Tamil, Telugu with a prefix-suffix pattern and what meter was used, and he proposed that there is something called a Dravidian language. So once he did that, that was a received wisdom. Things have not changed since. That's the accepted way of doing it. His works were inherited by two missionaries. One is G.U. Pope and Robert Caldwell. And ever since, it became the common way of looking at southern Indian languages, that there are a separate family called Dravidian. Michael Witzel says there is no Dravidian loanword in the oldest Vedic layers, and they appear later only in words of commercial transactions. Again, very interesting over there. Then there is more Sanskrit in Dravidian than so-called Dravidian in Sanskrit. And also this M. Renault in 1956, he says a Dravidian loanword ceased towards a common era, implying, he's believing in Aryan invasion theory, implying exit of Dravidians in the Ganga Valley. So you find these things debated by Conrad Lelst over here. So in India today, academia calls it something called a linguistic area. Linguistic area is something academia uses to, they call it a Sprackbund, a place where many languages seem to coexist, and we have all of these language families, the sizes of these families over here. Today there are academicians who use something called Bayesian phylogenetics in order to try and see the roots of the so-called Proto-Dravidian. In other words, how are all these words, Tulu to Kannada to Malayalam, Telugu, all these words, how are they related to each other and where is their ancestor? So by making use of the same tools as genetics, they try to do mathematically to see where is it related, and they come with something like 2500 BC is where the ancestral Proto so-called Dravidian languages. However, the criticism to levy against these things is, why wouldn't they also investigate relationships with existing Indian languages, Sanskrit and other such languages? So if they had embedded the relationships and looked for a common root, we would have found different things. So they have already used Ellis White's idea that there is a Dravidian language in the northern Indian languages, and used that as a constraint to build these mathematical models, and use that in a circular logic to try and prove whatever they want to prove. So this is the fallacy of these kind of studies.